remember what it was called. It was probably even before Rogan. It was
Okay.
that early. I mean, I do everything before Rogan and after,
Yeah.
because before Rogan, my book was disappearing. After, all of a sudden, I got inundated with attention and
hmm
requests.
hmm Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely check that one out. Um, I was curious to know if you had any sort of opinion just about the general theme that seemed to pop up within these characters and the people surrounding the Manson case. You have all these people who are either children or belong to military intelligence. They're all involved in the drug trade. You have Hank Fine, Billy Doyle, Charles Taco, all these different people, Pick Dawson. What's the deal with all these people who, I mean, are these spooks, for a lack of a better word, CIA agents that are embedding themselves in the counterculture? That's my guess would be
Well, I mean,
why does that?
I tried to be careful with that because I
I
know
know
a
you
lot
can
of
only
people.
speculate so much, so I'm so feel
Yeah,
free to.
no, a lot of people read this book by Dave McGowan, the something Laurel Canyon something,
Yeah, weird
and
scenes.
he thinks, he accuses everybody of being a product of intelligence because their parents were. You got to remember, back then we had just come out of World War II, then
Of
the
course.
Korean War. My father was in the war,
Hmm
and then in the '60s, there were a lot of kind of spooky kind of people around Hollywood and stuff.
hmm
But also, the war, we were in the Vietnam War by about 64, 65.
Yeah,
Um, so people were going to war, people were coming back from war. But no, I mean, the Doyle Taco Dawson thing, there's something there. There's something there, but I'm still not sure what. But I'm also,
yeah,
I want to be real careful that just because somebody's father was, I mean, Sharon Tate's father was in military
right,
intelligence, and he would not share information with me. That's in the book
right.
about his own investigation. It was really frustrating. Um, it's one of those really hazy areas that, and again, it's why it took me so long to write the book. I didn't want to just throw shit out there that I couldn't at least feel like it was somewhat viable,
Right.
somewhat provable. And I have respect for McGowan because he did what he did before me. But when I got the book, I just didn't see any kind of substantiation. There's no
hmm
endnotes, footnotes,
hmm
nothing. And a lot of stuff is so speculative. I'm like, I can't be like that. I gotta
Yeah.
prove everything I'm putting on the page.
Yeah, and that's appreciate your Chaos is probably one of the most well-sourced books I've ever read. I mean,
Oh, thank
almost
you.
every page has multiple, notes and sources at the end. And some of the more interesting things are found in this, in your sourcing at the end. So
Yeah,
definitely
yeah.
encourage people to pick up a physical copy of it to get to enjoy those parts too. And you mentioned McGowan's book, which I do enjoy that book. I'm a fan of his work in general. And you're right that a lot of it isn't sourced. But I would say that some of the more important points or some of the important connections he makes in that book are, pretty easily verifiable from things like Jim Morrison's dad, uh, and his involvement in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Frank Zappa's dad working at Edgewood Arsenal, which is obviously a place that was implicated in MK Ultra.
Yeah.
So I think, like with any of these types of things, you have to take it with a grain of salt. But I do want to know what you think about the concept of music and some of the parallels between the hippie scene and the music scene. And I know that you do acknowledge that, for example, I think it was Dave Smith who set up the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. He had this uncanny premonition that, suddenly all these children are going to flood into the Haight
Yeah.
and going to be taking drugs. I'm going to just set up shop here. So I know you do acknowledge that there's this kind of inorganic manufactured aspect to that scene, the Haight and Laurel Canyon and stuff.
Yeah.
Don't you think that music could, what better way for
Oh,
them to
yeah. I
kind
think
of
it's definitely
proliferate these
possible. If
ideas?
you're asking, do I think the CIA was like using the Grateful Dead to get LSD out into the
Right.
population and then watch what happens? Yeah, I think that's possible. I didn't go too much. I try to really keep my thing narrowly focused
hmm
on what was
hmm
happening at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the funding for the clinic came from the federal government at the National Institute of Mental Health, but also from the rock world, from Bill Graham, throwing benefit concerts with
Yep.
the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane and Janis Joplin and all those bands. And David Smith was really immersed in that world. And, he's another mystery character to me. I
Yeah.
didn't feel like I ever really got a handle on what he knew that was going on. Was he just a kind of ignorant fool who was being used by people more powerful than him, or was he very aware of what was happening? And I don't know. I don't know.
That's
But
another
the music,
question.
yeah, the music world up there, when Manson first got there, and then when he migrated down to here, where I am, Los Angeles, and immediately immersed himself, with the Whiskey A Go Go and the Sunset Strip scene, and all of a sudden is hanging out with the Beach Boys and Terry Melcher and Neil Young and whomever else.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of those, it seems like Manson was more a part of that scene than we'll have, to an extent that we'll really never know fully
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
his
definitely. I mean, there are a
relationship
lot
with.
of musicians who did not just musicians, but people in the culture
Hmm.
who were, recognizable people
Hmm.
who had, let's just say, been around Manson who didn't want the world to know that. I
Yeah.
mean, Dennis Wilson was one of the people who kind of embraced it, but then when they needed him, again, I could never get an answer from Bugliosi about this. He should have been testifying about the family, not Terry, not anybody else.
Right.
And I think he wouldn't do it because he wouldn't lie.
Hmm.
And I think that was a difference. The others would lie. And I think I show in my book how much Terry lied,
Yeah.
but I don't think Dennis would. And, kind of cryptically, Dennis died, I think, in the 80s when he jumped off his boat to get something. He was pretty badly in bad shape then from years of alcohol abuse and drugs. And he never came up. He drowned. But he had said in the years preceding that one day he was going to tell the true story of Charles Manson and
Mm.
what happened in August of '69. He said that in a couple of interviews.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah, there's a picture of Manson with Dennis Wilson. I think it's Dennis. Yeah, it's Dennis Wilson, and it's just so crazy because the picture looks so candid and normal. They're like in a mixing booth or something in a studio, and it looks like a picture that would come out of, like the liner notes in a record or
Yeah,
something. It looks that casual and like it's just these two collaborators working together, nothing unusual, you
yeah,
know.
yeah,
So, it kind of, and this is a sort of a, controversial topic, but I have sort of a working theory about Manson potentially as a person who was maybe used. He obviously had multiple uses, but there seems to be this theme of blackmail that comes up within the untold story of Manson, whether
yeah.
it's the tapes that Bugliosi had hidden of him forcing Sharon Tate to be sleeping with multiple men at once. And it kind of mirrors some other individuals that we now know about, today, whether it's
You're talking about
Epstein.
Epstein or something?
Well, I mean, I think that the blackmail and stuff comes up enough in this case that it started to really stick out as a pattern to me. Do you know who Vito Palikis is?
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a
He's
quote.
not in my book, but I mean, he was really the first hippie in
Yeah.
LA
He was
who
the proto Manson almost.
started his own kind of family and group.
Hmm.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I did a lot of research into him. Never felt like I could find anything to connect him to the facts of what I was doing.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of questions about what he was doing. I mean, it was almost like Manson modeled himself after him.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I know there's still people alive who were close to him and around him. But yeah, I mean, wow, you've got a hell of a more wide berth of knowledge than I had or have, even if you know about him.
Well, I'm just a little obsessed with all, I've
Sounds
spent
like
a
it,
lot of
yeah.
time looking into it. But Vito is interesting to me because he kind of was this proto Manson type of character, right? He
Yeah.
was one of the, original hippies, really that whole scene. He's credited by people like Zappa as, having kind of pioneered it, and it wouldn't have existed the way it did without him. These early shows, the Whiskey Go-Go, all these different places.
Yeah, he'd
He
bring
was,
his girls and they would all dance under the strobe
yep,
lights and be on LSD and Then he had that awful child death at his house where one of his kids, I think, fell off a roof or
Which is
something.
curious because there's actually a connection sort of to Manson in that whole scene there with that because the child that died, it was one of his, I think his firstborn son maybe, but he was slated to play baby Lucifer in a film by Kenneth Anger, who was this
Oh,
like
oh my
avant-garde
God.
filmmaker in LA back then, a very spooky
No,
character.
Kenneth Anger was also connected to the Manson world through Bobby Beausoleil and
Right.
Susan Atkins. Yeah.
And Beausoleil actually, I think, ended up playing the part in that movie in Lucifer Rising. He played the part, I
Yeah.
believe, that Vito's son, who had an untimely death, was supposed to play in the first part. And
Wow.
another reason why I bring up Kenneth Anger is because, um, among other, there's a lot of reasons to connect him, whether it's the Process Church and some of these weird occult connections that he had and stuff. But Kenneth Anger was, for a long time, rumored to make these films that I guess were off the market for very specific clientele. They were never released, and it was kind of, hinted at that they were always of a sexual nature.
Yeah.
And he was also good friends with like Hugh Hefner and some of these people. Apparently, Bugliosi was really good friends with Hugh Hefner.
Oh
But
yeah.
I bring
Oh
that
yeah.
up because I know that you acknowledge even in your book that just a couple quick facts that Roger Smith and Jolly West, it's very possible that they were having sex with Manson's girls. You mentioned that I think in a footnote actually, you mentioned that Dennis Hopper was on record saying that the things in that scene and
Yeah.
around the Tate house had degenerated to this point where he said something like they were into sadism and masochism and bestiality, and they had it all recorded on videotape. It was all on
Yeah.
videotape, and he was told
Yeah.
this by the LA police. So that
Yeah.
right there is a big red flag to me in that this theme of blackmail just keeps coming up, and Bugliosi was even involved in covering it up. I mean, this is
Yeah.
really getting at this is really, speculating. But what if the Manson family went in that night because they had to, procure some tape or some piece of blackmail evidence that was in there that they
Good
needed to get their
question.
hands
Yeah.
on? Have you
No, I
ever
tried to
examined it from that angle at all, like this blackmail stuff?
yeah, I wanted to talk to Anger and I knew two young men who lived with him
Hmm.
and they went to him on my behalf and he said he wouldn't talk to me about any of this stuff. And then they said we could get in trouble with him for doing this, but if you come to this gallery opening, he's going to be at it
Oh,
and we'll introduce you. And so I tried and I met him briefly. And the minute I said my name and could we talk later or something, he was just go away. And I think he only this was 15 years ago or longer. He only died, I think, a few years ago.
yeah, very recently, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's so frustrating doing this kind of reporting because all these people, and you don't know whether people are doing this just because of their own kinky pleasure and boredom, like
Right.
sending you off on these wild goose chases. But I had heard a lot of the stuff you're talking about, and I always tried to see whether there is, a cache of videotapes
Hmm. Hmm.
um, that, Ed Sanders wrote about them, and his book came out before Bugliosi's, The
Right.
Family, and he's all over that with his book. And I talked to a couple of the people who were integral to protecting what if the tapes existed, there were a couple cops who had become PIs
Hmm.
who claimed to have them. And I mean, I can't tell you how spooky and scary that got when I was pressing those guys for just kind of get some kind of information about where could I find them, who has them. It's just so many fucking blind alleys I went down for
Yeah,
this. But
I
I'm
can't imagine.
the bad news is I'm working on a second book, so I'm still doing it. And I wanted to just stop doing it in 2019.
Well, that's
And
good
I,
news for all of us.
yeah, thanks. I got to be your sacrificial lamb.
One more thing about well, actually, I got two little quick things about the blackmail thing, if you don't mind. But I know you mentioned that you didn't really watch many of Manson's interviews in your research for it, just understandably so. He speaks in riddles. He sounds like a lunatic for the most part in these old interviews with him. But there's one that stood out to me in particular. Forget who he's talking to in this interview. It's in the 80s, and out of nowhere he brings up and says, I think verbatim, Sharon was killed over a little black book. and he implies
Yeah.
that this book was acquired by Roman
Doug
Polanski.
Bruckner. Doug Bruckner was one who interviewed Manson when he said that he had a show called was a tabloid TV show.
Maybe, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the famous Black Book. I tried to find it. I found the cop who supposedly took it from the house,
Mhm,
and according to some family members of the LaBiancas, never gave it to the evidence and
mhm,
kept it.
mhm.
He denied that and then hung up the phone on me. I've
Oh, wow.
never been able to verify that that black book existed, what was in it. Again, Manson is just as bad as, the authors out there. He'll throw shit out there, I think,
Mhm,
because he's bored.
mhm.
He'll repeat stuff he's heard from other people. I should say he did this stuff. And that's why I stopped watching. I began watching the interviews, and then I just thought, oh no, he's just having fun. I mean, when I interviewed him a few times, he said crazy, crazy stuff. And, I don't know how much of it was calculated, how much of it was because somebody screwed up his head.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know.
What do you make of the other comments in that interview where he brings up Peter Sellers and some other famous actors of that time. He says something about them in a closet with poor little Sharon and dogs. He specifically mentions dogs. So again, kind of corroborated by Dennis Hopper's quote about bestiality.
Huh.
You
I
think
don't
that
remember
could
that
be?
that part of it. You might have seen a longer version. And it's been a long time since I've looked at it, but I don't know what to say because I don't remember the thing about the dogs in the closet and
Yeah,
Sharon.
it's weird. It's weird. And Peter Sellers, but of
Well,
course
I
we're
know Peter
mentioning
Sellers.
Manson.
So the people that put out the first reward
Hmm.
when the murders had just happened and they were unsolved was Peter Sellers, Warren Beatty, Steve McQueen. I think a half dozen Hollywood male actors
Hmm. Hmm.
put out a reward. And what people thought was they wanted to somehow manage whatever information came out. And the theory was that they were on these videotapes that had been shot and it would ruin their careers and they
Hmm.
wanted to get them. I could never figure out whether any of that was true or not.